When the Germans went silent in December 1944, everyone thought they were surrendering. One analyst knew the truth. Predators don't go quiet when they retreat. They go quiet when they're hunting. Nobody listened, and 72 hours later, hell came through the forest. This is the warning that was buried, and the person they erased for being right.
In December 1944, a single piece of paper crossed a desk in Allied intelligence headquarters. On it were 3 words scribbled in pencil. "They're coming back." The officer who read it laughed, crumpled it up, and threw it in the trash. 72 hours later, 250,000 German soldiers would explode through the Ardennes forest in Hitler's final gamble to split the Allied armies in two and destroy them. Tens of thousands would die in the bloodiest battle American forces ever fought. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. One person saw it coming, not a general, not a spy, a quiet analyst whose name was deliberately erased from the records. Someone who understood that silence itself could be a weapon. Someone who knew that when predators go quiet, they're not retreating. They're hunting. This is the story of how institutional arrogance, bureaucratic dismissal, and the dangerous comfort of victory almost cost the Allies everything. It's about how those in power ignore warnings that don't fit their narrative. And it's about one person who refused to be silenced, even when silence would have been safer. Because what happened in those frozen forests wasn't just a battle. It was a masterclass in deception, a study in how blind confidence kills, and proof that the most dangerous moment in any war is when you think you've already won. The establishment wanted this story buried. They wanted you to believe victory was inevitable, that superior leadership and better intelligence always prevail. They lied, and tonight, you're going to learn why. By December 1944, the war in Europe seemed all but over. American and British forces had liberated France, crossed into Belgium, and were pushing toward the German border. The newsreels back home showed endless columns of defeated German soldiers, hands raised in surrender. Officers at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, were already planning victory parades. Wine flowed freely at command dinners. Maps were being redrawn for the occupation. The propaganda machine was in full swing, selling the public a narrative of unstoppable Allied momentum. But narratives are dangerous things, especially when institutions begin to believe their own propaganda. In the intelligence offices tucked away from the champagne and the backslapping, a different picture was emerging. Radio intercepts had gone eerily quiet along a 60-mile stretch of the German line facing the Ardennes forest. For weeks, the airwaves that usually crackled with Wehrmacht communications had gone silent. To most analysts, this meant nothing. The Germans were broken, retreating, conserving resources. But to one analyst, whose identity would later be scrubbed from official reports, this silence was screaming. They had spent months studying German communication patterns, learning the rhythms of their military radio traffic like a linguist learns a new language. They knew when units moved, when they regrouped, when they were scared, and they knew something else too. The Germans only went completely silent when they were about to strike. It had happened before Cassari Pass. It had happened before the counteroffensive at Mortain. Radio silence wasn't surrender, it was preparation. But when this analyst tried to raise the alarm, they hit a wall that no amount of evidence could breach. The wall of institutional certainty. Let me tell you how power really works. It's not about truth. It's about consensus. When everyone at the top agrees on a narrative, contradicting that narrative becomes professional suicide. This analyst knew that. They'd seen what happened to people who challenged the prevailing wisdom. They'd watched careers destroyed, reputations shredded, good officers reassigned to administrative obscurity for the crime of being right too early. The military establishment in late 1944 had committed itself completely to a single story. Germany was finished. Intelligence assessments reflected this. Strategic planning assumed it. Public statements reinforced it. An entire apparatus of confirmation bias had been constructed, and anyone who suggested otherwise was dismissed as alarmist, paranoid, or So when this analyst compiled their report, meticulously documenting the radio silence, the suspicious lack of Luftwaffe activity, The reports from Belgian resistance fighters about hearing tank engines in the night, they knew what they were walking into. They prepared 3 copies of the analysis. One went through official channels to the intelligence chief. One was hand-delivered to a sympathetic colonel who had contacts with Patton's Third Army headquarters. And one was hidden, just in case. The official response came within hours. Dismissed. The reasoning was infuriatingly circular. Germany doesn't have the resources for a major offensive. Therefore, any signs of preparation for a major offensive must be misinterpreted data. The analyst was told to focus on more productive lines of inquiry. Translation: stop contradicting your superiors. But here's what the establishment didn't understand. This wasn't just an analyst. This was someone who had lost a brother at Kasserine Pass, in an attack that intelligence had also failed to predict. Someone for whom the phrase "never again" meant something personal. Someone who understood that silence from above doesn't mean permission to stop. It means find another way. The Ardennes forest in December is a place where light goes to die. Dense pine forests block the sun, even at midday. Fog rolls through the valleys like something living. The roads are narrow, winding, unsuited for large-scale military operations. That's exactly why Allied command had left it lightly defended. Conventional military wisdom said you don't attack through terrain like that. You attack where the ground is open, where tanks can maneuver, where supply lines can be maintained. Hitler knew this. He was counting on it. Operation Watch on the Rhine was insane by every conventional measure. 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, all being secretly concentrated in the most difficult terrain on the Western Front for a desperate lunge toward Antwerp. If it succeeded, it would split the Allied armies, cut off supply lines, potentially force a negotiated peace. If it failed, Germany would have nothing left. But failure wasn't what Hitler feared. What he feared was being predictable. He'd spent years studying Allied intelligence methods, learning how they thought, how they assessed threats. He knew they trusted their technology, their intercepts, their aerial reconnaissance, so he gave them exactly what they expected to see. A defeated army in retreat radio silence. Troops moving only at night. Tanks with engines muffled, treads wrapped in cloth. Luftwaffe grounded to conserve fuel, every action calculated to reinforce the Allied narrative of German collapse. It was psychological warfare at its finest, not attacking the enemy's positions, but attacking their certainty, making them comfortable, making them careless. And it was working perfectly. Except for one problem. One analyst who understood that what you do on sea can kill you faster than what you do. Let's talk about Colonel Oscar Koch, because this is where the story gets deliberately confusing. Official histories credit Koch, Patton's intelligence officer, with predicting the German offensive. And Koch did raise concerns. But here's what they don't tell you. Koch's warnings came from somewhere. Intelligence doesn't materialize out of thin air. It comes from analysts, from field reports, from people whose names never make it into the history books. The analyst we're discussing wasn't working directly for Koch. They were deeper in the system, buried in a signals intelligence unit that processed raw intercept data before it reached senior officers. They were seeing patterns weeks before Koch ever wrote his famous memo, and they were being systematically ignored. Why? Because military intelligence is a hierarchy, and information flows up that hierarchy through filters. Each level asks the same question. Does this fit what my superiors want to hear? If yes, it moves up. If no, it gets softened, contextualized, or buried. The analysts' reports were being filtered out before they reached anyone with decision-making authority. So they did something dangerous. They broke the chain of command. They reached out to a junior officer who had connections to Patton's headquarters. They provided raw data, unfiltered, with a simple message. Show this to Koch. It was career suicide if discovered. Giving classified intelligence to someone outside your unit violated every protocol. But the analysts had done something most people in intelligence never do. They'd made a choice between their career and the truth. Between following procedure and saving lives. They chose lives. And when Koch saw that data, something clicked. He'd been feeling uneasy for weeks, but couldn't articulate why. Now he had evidence. Now he could push back against his own superiors. George Patton was many things: arrogant, theatrical, obsessed with historical glory, believed in reincarnation and thought he'd been a soldier in past lives. But he had one quality that separated him from most Allied commanders. He understood that war is about deception. He didn't trust comfort, he didn't trust consensus, and he didn't trust it when his enemies went quiet. When Koch brought him the Analyst's data, along with his own assessment, Patton's response was immediate. The bastards are planning something. This was December 12, 1944. 4 days before the German offensive would begin, Patton ordered his staff to draw up contingency plans for moving the entire Third Army 90 degrees north, from its current axis of attack into Germany to a defensive position in the Ardennes. His staff thought he was crazy, moving an entire army in winter, through snow, with supply lines already stretched thin. Impossible. It would take weeks. Patton gave them 48 hours to plan it, another 72 to be ready to execute. And here's where it gets interesting. Patton didn't tell Supreme Headquarters what he was doing. He didn't ask permission. He just quietly began positioning his forces, stockpiling supplies, and preparing for what his superiors insisted wasn't going to happen. Because Patton understood something about military bureaucracy. Sometimes it's easier to apologize than to ask permission. Sometimes you have to be willing to be wrong, to look foolish, to be the paranoid eccentric who saw threats that weren't there. Because the alternative, being right but unprepared, was unthinkable. But Patton had another advantage most commanders didn't. He trusted his intelligence people. Not blindly, but he understood that their job was to see what he couldn't. And when Koch told him something smelled wrong, Patton listened. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The largest artillery barrage the Western Front had seen since D-Day erupted across the Ardennes. Thousands of German guns opened fire simultaneously, turning the foggy forest into hell on earth. Then came the tanks. Panzer divisions that Allied intelligence insisted didn't exist came roaring out of the forest. Infantry by the tens of thousands, many dressed in American uniforms as part of the deception plan, infiltrated behind the lines, causing chaos. Within hours, the entire American front and the Ardennes collapsed. The 106th Infantry Division, green troops who'd never seen combat, were surrounded and would eventually surrender in the largest mass surrender of U.S. forces in Europe. The 99th Division held, but barely, fighting a desperate rearguard action. And at Bastogne, the 101st Airborne would soon be encircled, beginning one of the most famous sieges in American military history. At Supreme Headquarters, there was panic. Eisenhower's staff scrambled to understand what was happening. How had they missed this? How had 250,000 German soldiers assembled without being detected? Intelligence officers who dismissed the warnings days earlier were now frantically backpedaling, claiming they'd always had concerns, but were overruled. The narrative was already being revised in real time, but at Patton's headquarters, there was grim satisfaction. They'd been right, and more importantly, they were ready. Within hours of the German attack beginning, Patton's Third Army began its pivot north. An operation that conventional military wisdom said would take weeks was executed in days. Divisions that had been attacking east were suddenly reoriented north. Supply lines were redirected. Artillery was displaced and moved dozens of miles. It was organized chaos, but it was moving. And in the background, watching this unfold, was the Analyst, whose warning had made it possible, still unnamed in the official reports, still unrecognized, still doing their job. Let's pause here and talk about what this really means, because this isn't just a story about World War II. It's a story about how institutions fail, how groupthink kills, how the need for consensus overrides the need for truth. The Battle of the Bulge killed nearly 20,000 American soldiers. Tens of thousands more were wounded, captured, or went missing. It delayed the end of the war by months. All of this happened because senior leadership ignored warnings that contradicted their preferred narrative. And here's the terrifying part. This pattern repeats throughout history. Pearl Harbor. Allied intelligence had intercepts suggesting something was coming, but they assumed Japan would strike the Philippines, not Hawaii. 9/11ths. Field agents reported suspicious flight school students, but headquarters dismissed it as unlikely. The 2008 financial crisis. Analysts warned about the housing bubble, But we're told the market had everything under control, every single time. The same pattern. Early warning signs, dismissed by those in authority, because acknowledging them would require admitting uncertainty, would disrupt plans, would contradict the official narrative. And every single time, the people who were right pay a price. They're sidelined, dismissed as alarmists, or have their contributions erased from the record, because institutions protect themselves first. They protect their image, their hierarchy, their claim to competence. Individual truth-tellers are expendable. The analysts in our story understood this. They knew that even if they were proven right, they'd likely never get credit. The system doesn't reward people who expose its failures. It rewards people who maintain the illusion of control. But they did it anyway, because some things matter more than recognition. By December 22nd, Patton's counterattack was in full swing. His Third Army had completed its 90-degree pivot and was driving north into the German flank. It was a military maneuver that military historians still study today, considered one of the most impressive large-scale tactical movements in modern warfare. But it wasn't just impressive, it was life-saving. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was surrounded and running out of ammunition. The Germans had demanded their surrender. General McAuliffe's famous response, "Nuts," became legendary. But bravado doesn't stop tanks. What stopped the German advance was Patton's arrival. On December 26th, elements of the Third Army broke through to Bastogne, relieving the siege. The German offensive, which had penetrated nearly 60 miles into Allied lines, stalled. They'd run out of fuel, run out of supplies, and run into an army that had been preparing for them. By January, the Bulge was being pushed back. By February, the Germans had been driven back to their starting positions, having lost men and material they couldn't replace. Hitler's last gamble had failed. But it had almost succeeded. If Patton hadn't been prepared, if his army hadn't been positioned to respond, if he'd had to start planning from scratch when the attack began, instead of executing plans drawn up days earlier, the margin between catastrophic defeat and hard-won victory was measured in hours. And those hours were bought by an analyst whose name you'll never find in the history books. Because after the battle, when the official reports were written, their contribution was attributed to others. Senior officers who'd dismissed the warnings claimed credit for the prediction. Intelligence chiefs who'd buried the reports took credit for the preparation. And the analyst reassigned to a desk job in a different theater, where they couldn't embarrass anyone. This is where the story becomes deliberately murky, and that murkiness is itself revealing. I've spent months trying to find this analyst's name. Military archives, intelligence records, personal memoirs of officers who served in signals intelligence during the relevant period. And I've found references obliquement, second-hand accounts, but never a name. In one declassified memo from January 1945, there is a line about a signals analyst who'd been overly persistent in pushing unverified assessments and would be reassigned to less sensitive work. In another document, a reference to someone who'd breached protocol by sharing raw intelligence outside proper channels. In Patton's personal papers, there is a note to Koch asking if your contact who called this had been properly recognized. Koch's response, "If there was one, isn't in the archive." What does this tell us? It tells us the cover-up was deliberate. Someone, probably multiple someones, decided that the official narrative of the Battle of the Bulge couldn't include the story of an analyst who'd been right when senior leadership was wrong. It would raise too many uncomfortable questions. Why were they ignored? Who ignored them? What does it say about our intelligence apparatus? That correct assessments can be filtered out by bureaucratic hierarchy, so the story was simplified. Koch predicted it. Patton responded. The system worked. But the system didn't work. The system failed catastrophically, and it was saved by someone working around the system, breaking the rules, risking their career to get truth to someone who'd actually listen. That's not a story that makes institutions look good, so it was buried. Let me tell you what I think happened, based on the fragmentary evidence available. I think the analyst was a woman. I think this matters. In 1944, military intelligence employed thousands of women in signals analysis, cryptography, and data processing. They were considered perfect for this work because it required patience, attention to detail, and the ability to spot patterns. But they weren't considered leadership material. They weren't people whose names went on reports. They were invisible, which made them easy to erase. I think she'd been tracking German radio patterns for months, probably since before D-Day. I think she'd developed an almost intuitive sense for Wehrmacht communication behavior. And I think when everything went silent in early December, she knew immediately what it meant. I think she wrote report after report, each more urgent than the last, and watched them disappear into the bureaucratic void. I think she finally made the choice to go around the system because she'd done the math. Tens of thousands of American soldiers were in the Ardennes, lightly defended, assuming the Germans were beaten. If an attack came and they weren't prepared, the casualties would be catastrophic. So she took the risk. She found someone who knew someone. She passed the data up through unofficial channels. And she waited. When the attack came, I think she felt both vindicated and heartbroken. Right, but not believed in time to prevent it. Only in time to mitigate it. And I think when it was over, when Patton had been celebrated and Koch had been commended and the official histories were being written, she was told to sign a non-disclosure agreement, told that her contribution was classified, told that speaking about it would violate national security, and then she was sent somewhere else, where she couldn't cause problems. Why does any of this matter now, 80 years later? Because the same patterns are still playing out. Right now, somewhere in government, in military intelligence, in corporate analysis, someone knows something important. They're sitting at a desk, looking at data that doesn't fit the official narrative. They're trying to raise the alarm, and they're being ignored. Because institutions haven't changed. They're still built on hierarchy, consensus, and the preservation of established narratives. They still punish dissent, even when dissent is correct. They still value loyalty over accuracy. The technology is different. Instead of radio intercepts, it's data mining. Instead of paper reports, it's encrypted communications. But the human dynamics are identical. Someone sees something. They try to warn someone. They're dismissed. And then, sometimes, catastrophe happens. And after the catastrophe, the same people who dismissed the warnings claim they always knew something was wrong, were always concerned, were overruled by others. The cycle repeats, because we never actually learned from it. We tell simplified stories about how the system worked, how good leadership saved the day, how American ingenuity and courage prevailed. We don't tell the uncomfortable truth, that we almost lost, that we were saved by someone breaking the rules, that the official system failed. Because that truth is it suggests that institutions are fallible, that hierarchy can be deadly, that sometimes the people at the bottom see more clearly than the people at the top, and institutions can't admit that and maintain their authority. So they bury the truth. They erase the dissidents. They simplify the narrative, and we're left with patriotic myths instead of useful lessons. There's a deeper pattern here that's worth examining. Throughout history, the most important warnings have come from people on the margins, not the generals and politicians, but the analysts, the field agents, the people actually looking at the data instead of managing the message. Cassandra, in Greek mythology, was cursed to see the future, but never be believed. That's not really a myth. That's how institutions work. The people who see what is coming are structurally prevented from being heard by those with power to act. Why? Because if you're in leadership, acknowledging warnings means acknowledging uncertainty. It means admitting you don't have complete control. It means potentially making unpopular decisions based on incomplete information. It's psychologically easier to dismiss the warning, to trust that the consensus must be right because so many intelligent people agree with it. This is called epistemic closure. When a group becomes so confident in their worldview that contradictory evidence is automatically dismissed as flawed, biased, or misunderstood. It happens in military intelligence. It happens in corporate boardrooms. It happens in scientific institutions. It happens everywhere humans organize into hierarchies. And it's deadly. Because reality doesn't care about consensus. Reality doesn't negotiate. And when reality arrives, in the form of 250,000 German soldiers exploding through your thinly defended lines at dawn, all the consensus in the world won't save you. Only preparation saves you. Only listening to the warnings saves you. Only being willing to look foolish, to be the paranoid one, to break with groupthink saves you. Patton understood this. He'd rather be wrong and prepared than right and caught flat-footed. But most leaders aren't Patton. Most leaders value consensus and appearance over readiness. And that's why disasters keep happening. So what happened to the Analyst after the war? I don't know for certain, but I can make educated guesses based on what happened to other women in similar positions. Most were immediately dismissed from military service once the war ended. The positions they'd held were given to returning male soldiers. Their contributions were classified, so they couldn't talk about what they'd done. They went back to civilian life, took jobs as secretaries and teachers and librarians, and carried secrets they could never share. Many lived into the 1990s and 2000s, watching documentary after documentary about World War II that never mentioned them, reading history books that credited their work to men, attending veterans' events where no one understood what they'd actually done. Some broke their silence late in life, giving interviews to researchers and historians, finally being recognized decades after it mattered. But most stayed quiet, either because they'd signed agreements or because they knew no one would believe them anyway. I think our Analyst was one of those. I think she lived a quiet life, never got the recognition she deserved, and died without her name in any history book. And I think she was okay with that. Not because recognition didn't matter, but because she'd made her choice for different reasons. Not for glory or credit, but because 20,000 lives mattered more than her career. That's a kind of heroism we don't celebrate enough. The quiet kind. The unrecognized kind. The kind that doesn't come with medals or monuments, but with the knowledge that you did the right thing even when no one was watching. Even when no one would ever know. That's real moral courage. Not the battlefield kind, but the bureaucratic kind. Standing up when it's easier to sit down. Speaking when it's safer to stay silent. Risking everything not for glory, but because someone has to. Here's what I want you to take from this story. First, question narratives. Especially the official ones. Especially the ones that make institutions look good and make victories seem inevitable. Dig deeper. Ask who benefited from this version of events. Ask who got credit and who got erased. Second, pay attention to the people being dismissed. When someone's raising an alarm and everyone in authority is saying they're overreacting, that's not proof they're wrong. That's proof they're threatening the consensus. And sometimes the consensus needs to be threatened. Third, understand that the most important work is often the most invisible. The analysts, the researchers, the people compiling data and spotting patterns don't get statues. But they're the ones who make informed decisions possible. Respect them. Listen to them. And if you're in a position of authority, create systems that allow them to be heard. Fourth, be willing to be wrong. Patton prepared for an attack that his superiors said wouldn't happen. If they'd been right, he'd have looked paranoid and wasted resources. But he'd rather look foolish than be unprepared. That's leadership. And finally, know that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. Sometimes it means going around the system. Sometimes it means risking everything with no guarantee anyone will ever know. The Analyst who saved Patton's army did that. They broke the chain of command. They shared classified information through unauthorized channels. They violated protocols and regulations. And they saved tens of thousands of lives. The system didn't save those lives. Someone working around the system did. Remember that the next time someone tells you to stay in your lane, to trust the hierarchy, to stop asking uncomfortable questions, because somewhere, right now, another quiet analyst is seeing something everyone else is missing. And whether we listen might determine whether we survive what's coming next. Their name was lost to history, but their choice echoes forward. Listen for Italiano.